Oh, hey, let's go. Okay, so today is on the validity of the concept of intelligence. And on Friday, we're looking at an extract from Frith's Cognitive Neuropsychology of Schizophrenia that I'll put on B-Space. I was a bit late putting the Gould for today on B-Space. It is now there, but unfortunately I called it Gould on Intelligence rather than Mismeasure of Man. It's about intelligence, but it's from the Mismeasure of Man. I hope you can find it. Maybe I'll change the title. Okay. But anyway, validity. We've come across the concept of validity before, right? You remember this? Validity? When I was a teenager, I went through a phase where everyone I knew was playing darts. So I was not very good at darts, so I got a book about how to play darts. And the book said, when you're playing darts, when you're learning how to be good at darts, the first thing you want is to be able to get your three... You know what darts is? Yeah? Okay. So this is a dartboard. You get your three darts in the same place. Don't worry about where they are exactly. Just get them onto the same place in the board. Once you've got them clustered, you can learn how to move the cluster around. But the first thing is to get them all hitting the same spot each time. It was of no help to me. To this day, I very rarely hit the board at all when I play darts. But anyway, that's... Yes?
Oh, I thought, this is also talks about validity of arguments.
Yes. Yeah, this is only the most tenuous connection with the idea of the validity of an argument that any of you who have done logic will have encountered, yeah. It's like it in that validity is a good thing and not being valid is a bad thing, but that's about all we have in common. You see what I mean? This is a different notion. It also has a long track record in philosophy, this notion of validity. It goes back to Kant, who talked about some concepts being a priori valid and some being empirically valid. But it's also a notion that every scientist will recognize. So just to illustrate it, just to give an example of what I'm talking about, there was a crisis in psychiatry in 1971 when psychiatrists in the UK and the US, then in 1971, it was with the UK and the US as it is now, just one in the same research community. People thought of themselves as in the same research community. And psychiatrists in the UK and the US were played videotapes of the same 12 patients being interviewed, and they were asked to classify the patients as either schizophrenic or not schizophrenic. And the astonishing finding was that there were big differences. You could be easily being classified by schizophrenic by one psychiatrist, not schizophrenic by another, therefore put in different courses of medication. And there was a general systemic difference in that the British concept of schizophrenia was much more tightly defined than the American concept. The bold circles there are the UK diagnostic categories. But it wasn't really as tight as that makes it look. It was pretty haphazard whether you were being classified as schizophrenic or not. And of course, that's a real shock. That's a real surprise. It shows that there's something wrong with the way that the concept of schizophrenia is being used, back then anyhow. So the analogy to the dartboard is the darts are going all over the place. They're not clustered. You see what I mean? You're not getting the same people classified in the same way each time. So that's reliability, getting the same people classified in the same way each time. And the natural reaction to this was to give very explicit criteria for whether you have schizophrenia. So in DSM-4, you give a checklist in today's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that every clinical psychiatrist uses. You're given a checklist for whether someone has schizophrenia. So you're given their behaviors, their symptoms, and you're classified as schizophrenic if you've got two or more of the following: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech. grossly disorganized behavior or catatonic behavior, and so on. If you meet enough of the criteria on the checklist, then you are classified as schizophrenic. That's the way it goes. Now, you see the point of that. That's like getting your darts clustered. That's like getting it so that you're always hitting the same thing each time. But of course, the next question is, are you hitting the thing you want to hit? Is this the right checklist to have? I'd just be curious. I keep asking you guys questions, but so I thought I'd write it up and see what you said. How do you think it should go? What is your gut impulse? Do you think that schizophrenia should be defined in this way, in terms of a checklist of symptoms? Or is it in terms of, should we think of it as a matter of having some brain virus? You know, if you're schizophrenic, there's some particular thing that should be wrong with your brain, not particularly to do with a checklist of symptoms. Or should we say what they were saying, in effect, back in 1970, that maybe you can't define schizophrenia, but an experienced psychiatrist will always be able to tell when it's present. So can you put your hand up if you think the answer to that is A, you should use a checklist? And if you think the answer is B, there's some possibly unknown brain virus, that's what schizophrenia is. And if you think the answer is C? Yeah. Okay, I'm curious. C is the one that really got challenged by the 1971 study. You see what I mean? Because these were all experienced clinicians who thought, well, I can tell you when a patient's schizophrenic. And then the shock was finding that they all diverge. On that. You see what I mean? Yeah. Yeah. And the toss-up between A and B is still a live issue, I think, today. It's just not known how you should go about this. But there's a general kind of philosophy of science question here. Skinner famously said, well, any kind of psychological category has to be defined in terms of the behaviors it gives rise to. Operationism is the practice of talking about your observations, the manipulations and calculations that you do on them. And then if you want to talk about whether someone believes someone, whether something's in pain, you've got your checklist. Here's how I tell whether someone's in pain. Here's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for shrieks. I'm looking for excitation. I'm looking for high galvanic skin responses. That's pain. Then you get classified as being in pain or not in these terms. On the other hand, you might say, no, maybe you hit the same thing every time when you get an operational definition. You get a checklist. But you might not be hitting the thing you want to hit. Maybe I classify everyone who shrieks. I get all the shriekers into one group, all the non-shriekers into another group. That's great. But what I wanted to hit was not shrieking, but pain. The thing underlying the shrieking. And that classification of people into the ones who are feeling pain and the ones who are not, that might be different. Yeah, so that's what you're thinking if you say the brain virus here. You're thinking, I don't know if I want a checklist, because I'm trying to get at something that lies behind the symptoms, something that explains the symptoms. That's what I really think is important about schizophrenia. So again, I'd just like to know what your feeling is. It's not that there's a right answer here. I'd just be curious what you say. If you're going to use scientific terms rigorously, should you go the way Skinner did and say you should always give a checklist definition in terms of the criteria you can observe? Or should we not do that? Because we should never do that. Because in science, usually what you're trying to get at is what lies behind the checklist. The thing that makes someone display those symptoms. Or, this contrast between reliability and validity isn't something specific to psychiatry. Every physicist using some measure of a black hole activity has got a question. Maybe my instruments give me the same result every time, but are they measuring what I think they're measuring? Every scientist has some form of this classification. And what's your hunch? Put your hand up if you think the answer is A. If you're going to be rigorous, you should always define your terms in terms of a checklist operationally. And if you think B, typically, or maybe always, you should not define them in terms of a checklist because you're trying to get at something that lies behind the checklist. And C, just don't define them. I guess that that's just a test. That can't be right. Okay. Any comments on that? I mean, there's a big difference in attitude here. It's very live in psychiatry at the moment. But through psychology, when people were arguing about behaviorism, you were exactly that issue. And anyone who's done work where it's difficult to pinpoint the phenomenon you're looking for, at some point thinks, well, to hell with the phenomenon I'm looking for. All I care about is a checklist. These unobservables, I don't know about them. Okay. So is that clear what the distinction is between reliability and validity? Yep. Yeah. How would they do it? Well, it would be a bit like what actually a medical doctor does. I mean, a physical, what's the word I want? A family doctor does when they're looking at you. They say they might not be able to give a checklist, but they've just been doing it a long time, and they think there's something wrong with your breathing. Say they just got a hunch. They couldn't put their finger on it. Just why? But they've got a sense that there's something wrong there. Yes, there might be something deep in the brain and you don't know what it's doing, what checklist it's working with. Yeah, that's right. That would be the natural diagnosis of what's going on here. Yeah. But it's not that you're explicitly trying to do that. The picture would be, I think the picture that many psychiatrists still have is, look, I've been working with schizophrenic patients for 50 years. I was trained by the best clinicians in how to recognize schizophrenia. I've seen hundreds, thousands of patients. I'll tell you who's schizophrenic and who isn't. I don't need a checklist. I mean, it's very natural to have that reaction. Yeah. But the trouble is that people diverge when they're doing it in that way. Yeah, you don't get reliability. In fact, you don't get reliability. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Is whether you think that schizophrenia is an underlying phenomenon at all, or whether you think that schizophrenia is just a series of behaviors
right.
that can be caused by a variety of different neural conditions.
Yeah.
But all that schizophrenia is picking out is a sort of set of behaviors that people
right.
with different conditions might be. Because if that's not the decision, then you might think A and B are perfectly compatible. The answer is that of course something is tracking from the next
yeah.
phenomenon.
If there's one there.
If there's one there.
Yeah.
The way to do that is of course to subtract the checkpoint. So it's a deeper disagreement about what our conception is of the kind of communication.
I think that's true. I think that's right. I mean, it used to be thought, the hope used to be that there will be a single brain virus for schizophrenia, a nice neat thing in the brain that you can see, oh look, there it goes, generating schizophrenia, just as viruses generate other diseases. But just this year, I think it was, there came out in Nature a paper identifying over 100, now that there is the Human Genome Project, the Human Genome mapped, people are able to do all these massive studies where at the moment they have over 100 genetic markers for schizophrenia. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are likely to be several hundred more genetic markers for schizophrenia. And what that means is you're not getting a nice clean mechanism here. They might all converge in generating a big, a big bulb in your brain or something, but it's really very unlikely that's what's going to happen. It's entirely possible. It might all just vanish off into the trackless wastes of the complexity of the brain. You might not have any identifiable brain syndrome underlying schizophrenia. And then all you could do maybe, so far as I can see, would be to give the checklist. Yeah. Otherwise, you might say, no, we were focusing that on. So if you can think of reliability and validity in terms of something like the sight on a gun. You get a telescopic sight on a gun or something like that. One kind of thing you can have with a gun sight is very precise, as opposed to just a notch in the barrel where you could be pointing it at anything. You got a very precise thing that seems to be identifying to the millimeter what's in the center of the shot. That's precision. But it's another question: is the sight twisted? Is the sight dead straight? If the sight's twisted, then it's going to be very precise but not accurate. If the sight's right, so that's like validity. Are you getting the thing you want to get? Precision is I'm going to get exactly the same point every time. Yeah. But the trouble in science often is you don't have any gun sight. You don't have any way of identifying the thing you're trying to get at except by means of the tests you're currently using. That's what makes the whole question of validity so difficult, that you don't have any way of getting onto the schizophrenia or whatever otherwise than through your current tests. So is there a brain virus there or not? You don't know. Your only way of getting in it is by using the checklists you've currently got. Okay? Anything else on that? This is really important, I think, in any kind of discussion of sciences. It actually just came home to me in the last year how key this distinction is and how it pervades all of science, that question of the validity of the concepts that are being used. One big idea in science has always been putting numbers in things. That one way to get valid scientific concepts is if you can put numbers on them. One of the pioneers of chemistry was a PhD student who did not do all that well, and having completed his PhD, did not quite know what to do. So he wanted to put numbers and things. At that time, the distinction between an element and a compound was just coming into play. And he said, well, what can I do to put numbers on the elements? Well, what he did was he weighed them. That seems like an extremely stupid thing to do, right? Just weigh them. But it gives you a way of putting numbers on them. And when you put numbers on all the elements, when you weigh them, when you get the weights of all the elements, you are already on your way to the periodic table. That's really the foundation of the periodic table, discovering that the chemical properties of an element are a periodic function of its atomic weight. You are really getting there. And that's the foundation of all chemistry today. Once you did that simple thing of just putting a number on each element by weighing it. So with human beings, we want to study human beings scientifically. So you want to find magnitudes about humans that you can put a number on. And with intelligence, it's a very natural strategy. That's how we're going to begin the science of human beings. We want to get a periodic table of human beings. With IQ tests, you literally can put a number on people, and then you can find out how that impacts their behaviors. And just as with putting numbers on the elements, of course, when you're just weighing an element, that gives you a pretty crude, rough approximation, and then you find the deep basis of it in the atomic number. Then with intelligence, you could say, well, what I'm going to do is I've got a rough, crude way of putting numbers in people using IQ tests, and maybe that's going to reflect some underlying biological reality, like in correspondence with the atomic number. That's the way to approach human beings scientifically. People sometimes talk about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, that there doesn't seem to be any particularly good reason why the world should be governed by mathematical laws. And if you were God making the world, then why would you do it mathematically? What's so special about maths? Why not give a special significance to each color. Yeah, I mean, why do it but it just does seem to work mathematically. Anyway. Okay, so much for reliability and validity and how these might apply to the study of human beings. Anything on that? Plain as day? Okay, so let me ask you a further question. There's lots and lots of different IQ tests. I'm sure many of you will have done one or another kind of them. Now, they're reliable. People tend to get similar results whenever they do an IQ test. I'm sorry to say that you tend to get a bit worse on them as you get older. But there you go. But that apart, the thing is reliable. People get the same kind of result each time they do it. So you can ask the same question here that I was asking about schizophrenia. You got a checklist for putting a number in someone when you say, this is how intelligent you are. But is it the number that you want? I mean, is it valid? What is your immediate hunch? Can I ask you, okay, so will you take it that IQ tests are valid measurements of something? You know, there is something there that the gun sight is getting you onto. Put up your hand if you think the answer is yes. They are getting onto something real. And if you think the answer is no, and if you really truly don't have any opinion in this, wait a minute. There are three possibilities here: yes, no, and no opinion. Isn't that right? Let's do that again. How many people think the answer is yes? And how many people think the answer is no? And how many people don't have an opinion, don't have a view? Okay, so I make that roughly even, maybe slightly more yes than no, but roughly even. Okay, that is really interesting. I think it is a very hard question. And how would you resolve it? Well, the way it goes is that there are batteries of tests testing different kinds of ability. And what you find is that they're all correlated. So if you take the IQ number, if you took this class and took the IQ number for everyone, and then you looked at their scores on different verbal tests and on different mathematical tests, well, what this diagram shows is degree of correlation. So if you see the line going through the center there, up and down, that's the IQ number, and how far one of the other lines deviates from it represents how correlated it is with that central IQ number. So if you had another line going straight up and down in the middle there, that would be perfectly correlated with IQ number. If it deviates a bit, it's imperfectly correlated. If it deviates a lot, it's not correlated at all. Does that make sense? So what you find is that there's a lot of correlation between these different tests. You can put this abstract number, the IQ number, on the center axis, and then you find that these other tests are not deviating all that much. They're pretty highly correlated. So then we say, okay, there is an underlying, as it's called in the trade, G here, an underlying quantity G that different people have. And so your G factor will be something that enters into your performance on all these other tasks. And so that underlying G is being used when you do a verbal task or when you do a mathematical task. But other skills are coming into play too. So you'll have specifically verbal or mathematical ability, but this underlying G that is coming in, so people talk about the saturation of a test by G. And the important general finding is that subtests measuring different abilities tend to be positively correlated. People who score high on one such subtests are likely to be above average on others as well. So you've got here a checklist way of putting a number on people, and it really predicts well how people are going to do. One early hypothesis is that there's something here in the nature of an energy or power, how much battery power your whole cortex has. the particular group of neurons specifically serving a particular kind of operation, whether it's verbal or mathematical, that would thus, you'd have this general supply of energy, how powered up your whole brain is, and then these specific tasks are using other specific brain areas. So there are lots of hypotheses as to what the brain areas, what the brain activity might be that correlates with G, so with your IQ number. So it might be something like, I don't know why this always makes me laugh, but velocity of neural processing. That there is some evidence that just how fast your brain processes stuff, that's correlated with your IQ number. But there are other things correlated. The mere size of your brain is correlated. So there truly is a correlation between hat size and IQ number. Okay, so that makes it look like the periodic table. That makes it look like we've got a way here of putting numbers in people, and now we're finding the analog of atomic number. We're finding the bit of biology that this corresponds to. So if intelligence here is really a causal factor, then if you wanted to make a difference to how people perform, how well people do on all these tasks, the first thing you'd want to interfere with, the first thing you'd want to act on, is their intelligence. But there is a question. Is intelligence really something that's causally significant? So we talked about what causal significance means. It means you could come from outside, seize control of intelligence, move it around, and then you get a difference in all these other outcomes. For example, if intelligence is speed of neural processing, then that would be something that you could try to affect, and that would then affect people's behavior on verbal tests or on their motivation or their performance in their jobs and so on. I mean, does that sound right? Can you put up your hand if this sounds right so far? If it sounds wrong? Any comments? Why does it sound right or wrong? Okay. Just doing it in terms of numbers is not that satisfying, though, because so long as the G is a kind of abstraction from what you did in all these tests, the trouble is you could do the abstraction in lots of different ways. I mean, this is one of Gould's main points, that if you take those same verbal tasks and mathematical tasks, you could draw a line not straight up the middle, but through the middle of the verbal tasks and through the middle of the math tasks, and say there are two kinds of G. There's verbal G and math G. Not a single quantity here. And you'd have exactly the same evidence for that as you had for the existence of a single G. So the fact that you've managed to put a number on groups doesn't show that that number has any causal significance at all. And even if it does have causal significance, it might not have the kind of causal significance you take it to. Just getting a reliable way of sorting people like this doesn't yet show that you found anything that is causally affecting what goes on in the world. You found lots of correlations, but you may not have found anything about the causal functioning of human beings. I mean, you can say that, well, IQ runs in families, but even if something runs in families, as we said with schizophrenia, that running in families might involve hundreds of separate genetic factors. Usually what you're looking at when you look at interesting aspects of human psychology is weak effects of multiple causes. That's to say, you get hundreds of individual causes in the brain, that each of which is having a very weak effect, and they're totally together stacking up the outcome you're interested in. So is this is looking at IQ a way to study human groups scientifically? What would you think? Agree? Disagree? This is a good approach to the science of human beings. Put your hand up if you think yes. I mean, if you say yes, you're absolutely in agreement with mainstream psychology today. I just say that to embolden you, not to persuade you. What do you think? Yes? No? Okay, significantly more no than yes at that point. Why not? What's wrong? What's wrong with mainstream psychology? I don't know. Yeah. I guess yeah.
I just had a question again about what exactly the question is. So,
Yes.
So you write your opinion that look, the reason a lot of people perform really well on IQ tests is because of certain kinds of education that they've had. And
Right. Yes. Sure. It's environmental. It's not. It's not genetic.
So we're
Yeah.
not tracking some kind of genetic
Right.
ability,
Yeah.
but we are tracking some genuine phenomena.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if I have that opinion.
Yes.
Do I disagree about whether this is a good way to study human beings?
Yeah.
I mean, we are studying it scientifically and we're finding out what factors result in high phenotypes.
Yeah.
But they're not the kinds of factors we thought they were.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering how that fits into the...
Yeah, well, it has to. We'll come back to this, but it has to do with how you think of the validity of the concept here. If your thinking is, well, what I'm trying to aim this at is something genetic, then the points you're making would be completely destructive of that. But if you said, no, I'm trying to aim at something that may be greatly affected by educational or environmental variables, then you could say, yes, but I'm still getting what I want there. I think it's important that part of the idea here has always been that this is going to be something genetic. It seems unlikely that there's anything, as with most of human psychology, unlikely that there's anything that's purely genetic here. But as we'll see in a minute, you still hear that argument pushed very hard today. The real joker in this question is the notion of a human group. And what's a human group? I mean, the idea of studying groups and putting IQ numbers on them has been extremely inflammatory politically in the last 200 years, I guess. Part of the trouble with that is that human groups aren't typically organized on the basis of underlying aspects of their brains. I was once at a talk by someone who had spent a while trying to look at, he was an anthropologist, he spent a while looking at studying two groups of Buddhist monks. One group, they were very clearly distinct. One group had characteristically shaved heads. The other group, they were in the same region. The other group had extremely elaborate hairstyles. They didn't cut their hair. And the hairstyle, he showed us some photos, the hairstyles were just astonishing. Very, very elaborate. And his task was, what he was trying to do was discover what's the basis of the difference between the two groups. And different hypotheses had been tried. Maybe one was a contemplative group. The other was mainly an active farming group. Different kinds of devotional practice. He had spent quite a lot of time in this, and at the end of it, his conclusion was that the basis of the difference between the two groups was that one of them had shaved heads and the other had these really elaborate hairstyles. And the point of that is that humans don't tend to assort on the basis always of deep things in their brains. What pulls human groups together tend to be, human beings aren't like chemical elements. You don't pull together in the way that chemical elements do. So cultural groupings among humans, that might not be a good basis for scientific study in this IQ kind of way. Okay, I think I'll just go straight on because these questions have been really, they're still alive today. Here is Charles Murray writing in the Wall Street Journal for 2007. This is an argument, I actually heard the senator giving this kind of argument just last year. Murray says, education is becoming the preferred method for diagnosing and attacking a wide range of problems in American life. The No Child Left Behind Act is one prominent example. Another is the recent volley of articles that blame rising income equality on the increasing economic premium for advanced education. Crime, drugs, extramarital births, unemployment. You name the problem, and I will show you a stack of claims that education is to blame, or at least implicated. Like it or not, G exists. It is grounded in the architecture and the neural functioning of the brain and is the raw material for academic performance. If you do not have a lot of G when you enter kindergarten, you are never going to have a lot of it. No change in the educational system will change that hard fact. My point is just this. It is true that many social and economic problems are disproportionately found among people with little education, but the culprit for their educational deficit is often low intelligence. So this is not just an academic exercise, right? Anyone who wants to attack No Child Left Behind or any kind of educational support policy is going to use this argument. This is used today. This has been used through history. And actually, Murray's version of that argument there, as Gold points out in the extract, this argument goes back to the Greeks. This argument is very old. Murray's argument there is pretty mild, actually, compared to the other uses that have been made of it. The Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes was part of a movement ordering compulsory sterilization for people of perceived low intelligence. Public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state, namely those with low G, for these lesser sacrifices, namely compulsory sterilization, often not felt to be such by those concerned, to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. This was not an isolated thing. From 1927 to 1963, there were 64,000 sterilizations in the U.S. under these laws. They were drafted by Harry Laughlin, who was he was the architect of many of these laws. He was greatly admired by Adolf Hitler and was later awarded an honorary degree by the Third Reich for his important work here. So these things are really important. How you think you can study human groups scientifically. The thing about intelligence is that it belongs with concepts to do with our imaginative understanding of each other, our folk psychological understanding of each other, and in trying to translate them into the biological characteristics of the brain, you just run into, in a practical way, a lot of the issues that we've been discussing in a very theoretical way so far about how you can identify psychological characteristics with biological states. I don't know, you might say, look, this is an optional extra. Maybe this kind of argument has been, I take it I don't need to spell out, I take it I don't need to spell out the reservations you might have about this kind of argument. Yeah, you could have some reservations about this kind of argument. Yeah. But I guess one question is, could you have that approach to studying human groups, that I'm going to take a human group, put numbers on it, and explain that, use those numbers to explain the differences in behavior and performance of those groups, without having those kind of bad consequences? Maybe it's had those bad consequences all through history, right up to the present day, but maybe that's not essential. Hey, what's your feeling? Yes? Put up your hand if the answer is yes. You could detach them, and if the answer is no, whoa. Comment? Yeah?
Sometimes, it's possible that another reason for the separation could be that lower intelligence or that group of people don't have the ability to use their intelligence even if they have it.
Right. Well, the only thing about that way of putting it is it presupposes that there is that genetic thing, that G, that raw thing that is really being measured here, yeah, and that it is causally significant, yeah. The abstract numbers are beautiful. Nobody can complain about that. It's when you translate it and say, this is what's making things happen. This is the cause. And as Zumra was bringing out, when you have it in addition in your head, this is genetic. This is something that can't be changed. Because, how should I say it? This is what I was trying to find. This is what I was trying to aim my gunshot at. This was the bullseye. Something genetic, hardwired, that can't be changed by environment. So my numbers must be measuring that, because this is what I was aiming my tests at. Yeah. That's just unjustified. That's just you don't have any evidence for that. Okay. I just want finally to remark on the connection with validity here of the Flynn effect. Have you guys come across the Flynn effect? Put up your hand if you know the Flynn effect. Okay, some of you, yeah. It is really wild. In every country in which IQ tests are taken, since the beginning of records for people taking IQ tests, the average IQ keeps going up. What is it? Yeah, using the IQ values of today. I mean, the IQ. It's a bit hard to state this because for each generation, the IQ values get normalized so that the average number is always 100 in each generation. But if you compare how well people are doing in the tests done today with the way they were doing in the tests done 50 years ago, well, using the IQ values of today, the average IQ of the US in 1932 was 80. That is, a quarter of the population would have been labeled deficient by today's standards. Now, that can hardly be genetic, right? Evolution just doesn't work over 50-year periods, yes? Right. Yes. Exactly, yes, yes. Very good. Yes, that's completely correct. Yeah, yeah. Sorry? Across cultures, yes. I think that's right. I mean, I don't mean to be disrespectful to the industrious people who are trying to make good culture-free IQ tests or to adjust for levels of culture. It's just that the general question of what is going on here, what are we tapping into? Is there anything we're tapping into? Is still really live, it seems to me. And you're right, it can't be genetic or hardwired. Education or cultural, something must be what's affecting this thing here. But Flynn's background point is more than that. It's not just that this can't be genetic. It's, look at the numbers again. In 1952, only 0.38% of Dutch test takers had over 140 IQ, right? So that's a tiny fraction of the population has an IQ over 140 in 1982. By the same norms, 9.12 would exceed this figure in 1982. So if that's right, people are going. All the deficient people are moving up. All these people who are before, these sectors of the population that before were just regular guys are now geniuses with IQs of 140. If we're really measuring something real here that keeps going up so dramatically the whole time, well, how does Flynn put it? No, this is nicer, yep. The Netherlands should now be experiencing a cultural renaissance too great to be overlooked. So too should France, Norway, the United States, and many other countries. We should be seeing this outpouring of genius around us the whole time in a way that just didn't happen in the 1940s, say. But that doesn't seem to be what's happening. I mean, people just aren't that much smarter by any real criterion. So what that suggests is that even if the IQ tests are measuring something, even if there's a real thing there, it can't mean quite what we think it does. It can't have that significance. So that is another way in which this question about the validity of the construct comes in. That maybe there's something real there, something you're getting onto, but it might not have, it's more than just a checklist, but it might be something that matters only for your skill in relatively abstract problem-solving tasks, and not, as we say, for real life. And on that note, we'll pack it up for today and see you on Friday. Thanks, guys.